Okay, hello and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the British and American Culture class. I'm not sure about the lighting above my head here. Couldn't really fix it, so we'll just go with it. Don't have a lot of technical skill or assistance in producing these videos, so today is the quiz. I'm actually recording this ahead of time, but it's Wednesday and it's the 4th. I made a little joke there. We say, Star Wars fans say, may the force be with you. And so if you don't pronounce the S properly, you can say, may the 4th be with you. So may the 4th be with you, even though you're probably gonna watch this after you've done your quiz. It'll be the usual format, 12 o'clock at lunchtime until 12:10, and then you have the whole week to watch this. But since we are now lecturing in person on Friday, it would be really good for you to watch this ahead of time. I'm not going to record the Friday lecture anymore. That was just a privilege that we did for a couple weeks during midterms. A lot of people are still getting COVID, but I haven't had very many students email me in the last 2 weeks. So the numbers are getting low enough that we don't need to be concerned. So you need to come to class on Friday. It's not going to be recorded and uploaded for you to look at later. That's just going to be the way it is. This lecture, as I told you, will continue to be uploaded every Wednesday, and we will continue to do the quizzes online because it's just convenient. And for consistency purposes, I don't really want to flip a switch and go from online quizzes to offline quizzes for the last two. I just don't think that makes sense. So all the quizzes will be online, all the Wednesday lectures will be online, the final exam will be in person, and the Friday lectures will just be around an hour. I usually, as you have seen, those of you who have come, we don't take a break, we just keep going a little bit over an hour sometimes just to get things through all the material, and then if you have any questions, you can hang around afterwards and you can talk to me, or if you have any concerns. Okay, so the quiz that you're doing goes up to the famous people. So I'm going to talk about the famous people first, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about what the period is like after the Revolutionary War, including making some, not all the comments I'm going to make on slavery, but I'm going to introduce the topic to you because it's going to continue to be an issue that it turns eventually from slavery to discrimination and racism, which will never drop out of the course as an important idea. So let's move into this revolutionary conflict. I already kind of set it up. So we're on the eve of the revolution. They have the Boston Tea Party. The Sons of Liberty throw everything out. They're basically, we talked about death and taxes on Friday, right up here. They're going to, by step, sort of be incited to become rebellious and to fight against their own country, to create a sort of civil war, if you will, within the British Empire. A lot of these people who become the icons, the founders, they originally are pro-British. They are British, in fact. They are, by the time this war against France is won, the 7 Years' War, which George Washington participated in, and many of the other colonial British soldiers participated in. When that war is over, they're young, but it's not very long after that they start to become there starts to be unrest about the relationship between the colonies and the British Empire. Now, one thing to add to what I said already is one of the reasons that the British, first of all, the British are just trying to balance the books. It's been an incredibly expensive war. Sometimes people call the 7 Years' War the First World War because the French military and the English military fight on the 7 seas and on 4 continents. They fight in Asia. I'm not sure actually if they may have even fought in African areas as well. So you've got the Caribbean, North America, Europe, Asia, North Africa, all of India, all of these places. There's French allies, French and their allies against British and their allies. It's a global conflict. This is in the 18th century, so we're talking about easily 250 years ago that these gigantic states are vying for control of the world, of their territories, of trade. Trade is the big issue, of course. It's a lot of it's about money. It's about power and money, and the British managed to get the better of the French, and so they sign a treaty which redraws the lines. And one of the results is that the colony of New France in North America is turned over to the British. It's a pretty tragic story for the French colonists because some of them get deported, some of them get mistreated, some of them get arrested. There's a reason that there are still some tension between French Canadians and English Canadians, but I mean that happened a long time ago, and we've tried to overcome our differences there. But the treatment of a captured territory was not gentle, and some of them were deported back to France, and some of them were moved down to Louisiana, which was still French territory at that point, Spanish and French territory. So the legacy of the 7 Years' War is significant because it turns North America into a British territory. This is the British North America, and I mean British North America will continue to exist, but the essence of it is America. It's the United States, and when the United States secedes, when they break away, British North America becomes Eastern Canada, which is partly, French Canada. So, like the majority of the British North America all of a sudden isn't there. It doesn't belong to. So, I wrote this 1763 to 1783, R.I.P. Rest in peace, because it's really British North America as a complete entity only exists for 20 years. That's how long it takes for it to blow apart. And that shouldn't be surprising, really, because the 13 colonies are very different. New France is very different. And the parts of Canada that are going to become, settled by the English, Nova Scotia, and, New Brunswick is kind of French and English, but Ontario, all these other parts, they're all very different. I read a really good book that suggests that actually there's seven or eight nations that are distinct cultures in North America, and there's only 3 countries. So these 7 or 8 nations, they cross international borders and state borders, and without any regard for the idea that they belong to one country or another. They just unified with each other by their geography and their culture and their behavior and their economies and their religions and their attitudes and their history. So it's somewhat unnatural how the United States evolved, but they've whenever things went well, as I told you about the Protestant wind, in its appearance, to aid the British when they fought the Spanish Armada, or when William was trying to invade England and depose James II, they believed that this, there was a destiny. We have to talk about this further when we talk about the natives, but there's this concept of manifest destiny. which, as I said, it goes right back to the 16th century, and the belief that the small island of England was destined to be the leader of Protestantism, and to bring this light to the world. And when the Puritans, had their civil war and they took over, they thought this was their destiny too. The Puritans, we were supposed to transform England into this Puritan, state. But then they were overthrown, and then they had to go to the Netherlands, and they had to go across the ocean to find another place. And they were supposed to land somewhere farther south, but the wind blew them north up towards Massachusetts. And that's where they landed. They landed at Plymouth Rock, and they left from Plymouth in England, and they landed in Plymouth Rock. They couldn't be more synchronous in their minds, that we left Plymouth, we came here on ships, we hit this rock, we're gonna call this Plymouth Rock. This is the new state. This is the new kingdom. We're gonna create a new city on a hill, right, for everybody to look at and say that's what we want. And this is an idea that comes back to the Americans thinking they have this special status, that their country is the best and that they are the leaders and that everybody else looks up to them. That's instilled from the very beginning when things go badly, but they always somehow survive and come out of it. It looks like a terrible situation that can't be overcome, but then something comes along and they believe in themselves, and in their belief they are sustained. So it's not destiny that's created, it's not luck, it's already there. It's there, and it's for the Americans to fulfill it, right? They are the people of destiny. Just like in the Bible, when you read about the Israelites, they're going to the promised land, right? They are in the Bible, they are the chosen people of God. And the English believe this as in the 16th century as they're gaining strength. The Spanish believed it. The Spanish believed that they were the chosen people, and that's why the Spanish Armada sailed, despite the fact that they were probably going to lose. The King of Spain, King Philip, believed that God was on his side, that the Spanish were the chosen people of God. But the outcome proved him wrong and proved the English right. And then subsequently, big events again proved the English right. And when the English went to America, the British, when they became British, these events sustained the idea that they are the chosen people and that they're going to do great things, okay? The thing about the 13 colonies, as I said, is they are very diverse. They have different religious beliefs, they have different leadership, and because of the benign neglect I mentioned, that the king of the British, what is becoming the British Empire, especially during the Civil War, before and after the Civil War, there was financial problems with King James. King Charles had financial problems. Then he was killed. Oliver Cromwell was very busy with rebellions and wars with the Dutch and trying to exterminate the Irish. He was busy with many things, administering the Commonwealth. And then he died, and the Restoration happened. Charles II was spending lots of money, but James II was replaced. All these things are the financial system hasn't stabilized yet, and then they go to war with France because of William, and it's they try to stop Louis XIV. It's basically 100 years here of constant, financial instability, and they finally get finances in order, and then they get in another war with France, a global war this time. France never fixes its finances, so it's going bankrupt, but it's fighting anyway. And they finish the war, and by 1763, they're looking for ways to pay back all of the money that they've used in all of these conflicts. And it started out with the government being poor in the first place. So they're really, really stretching to the limit. And France is, like I said, France's finances they're gonna break. and the French Revolution is going to happen because the king can't manage to stabilize the kingdom's finances. So you've got these 13 colonies, and what they think is they're so different that they'll never work together. You know, these Catholics in Baltimore and these Quakers in Pennsylvania and these strange guys in Georgia who think they should have some sort of, you know, democratic government down there, and the Puritans in New England. How are these people ever going to get along with each other? We got the wealthy planters in Virginia that are trying to imitate English gentlemen. Like, these guys are completely different. We can just deal with them individually and try and, you know, collect taxes from them. But in putting the pressure on them to control those colonies, they push them together, even though it's the most unlikely of scenarios that they would ever manage to make a government together. But because of the British, you know, aggressive British policies, those Stamp Acts, Sugar Acts, Tea Act, and then sending soldiers and then shooting people that are protesting. They're rioting. They're not just protesting, they're throwing rocks at the soldiers and stuff. But the Boston Massacre was, you know, a turning point. These people in Boston don't want British soldiers watching what they do. It's like having an occupying army there. The British soldiers are not there to protect them. They're there to control them. Just like the Normans built the castles around England to make sure the English behave themselves. They don't want those Norman castles there. Those Norman castles are not there to protect the English. They're there to make the English behave. That's why the British soldiers are in Boston. The British military sends over soldiers to make sure that the Boston merchants pay their taxes, pay their duty, and sell the right tea, and that whenever they want to tax people, that they pay their taxes and follow the rules. So they start rioting, and then the British soldiers shoot some of them, and then that information gets spread around, and it just starts to get out of control. The trigger point is really Boston, but I mean, some of the colonies are less in favor of fighting, but they all have the same grievance. They all have this problem with, you know, people getting killed, people being losing their freedom. In this case, is, you know, it's not a death really. In some cases they are dying, but they're losing their business and they're losing their freedom. And they're being controlled by a government where they're not represented. So between the taxes and the Boston Massacre, which is a few people dying, but then the loss of business and control and their freedom, they start to think that it is just common sense. Thomas Paine, this is something I've neglected in my book, which will have to be corrected in the next edition. He writes this thing called it's called Common Sense. It's a pamphlet. It becomes very, very popular. It goes all over the place. Everybody reads it. Who can read, and if they can't read, they listen to other people read it to them. And it's an argument that the King of England is a tyrant. He has no business controlling our lives. It doesn't make sense. A small island can control a gigantic continent, etc., etc. He makes all these arguments about it being an unnatural situation. And this just continues to unify and build up the resistance amongst all of the American citizens, amongst the British colonists. Sorry, they're not American citizens yet. Just got to remember, I have trouble remembering this too. These are British colonists. They're British people. So let's get to Benjamin Franklin here. Benjamin Franklin was representative of all the pride and education and effort and success of the British colonist, but without the respect that he deserved. In America, he was up here. His status was above everyone else. He's the oldest of the founding fathers, and he was a genius. He was a polymath. He was a scientist. He was an inventor. He was a businessman. He was a politician. He was wealthy. He made various kinds of things. He was involved in writing. He was an excellent writer. He was kind of a philosopher. He dabbled in everything. He was a truly multi-talented, multilingual genius. He was kind of like, he was a Thomas Edison type person. An American British, but in the colonies, British colonies, but a Leonardo da Vinci or an Isaac Newton, the same kind of caliber. That's the type of person you're talking about here, and so when things start to become more and more intense, he is chosen to go represent the colonies and tell the Parliament in London what's going on here, to answer for what's all this rebellion, all this disruption, all these problems. And so he's willing, to mediate, and he's still interested in the colonies being a part of Britain. But when he goes over there to do this diplomatic work, he gets, invited to the Parliament with all these famous British politicians, which he's heard of and he knows. The Prime Minister is there, and all the other ministers of the British Empire, all these famous people and educated, sophisticated, wealthy people, and he's all impressed by it. And they sit him down, and then they yell at him and just dress him down and blame him, insult him, and treat him like a subordinate, like a naughty child. For the story is something like an hour. They just berate him like he's a second-class citizen. Like they're not listening to him explain anything. They're just accusing him of misbehavior, and you should be punished, and how dare you, and blah blah, etc. They just dress him down completely. The most famous, most respected British colonist in America. That's what they do to him. So he just sits there and listens to them. This guy who's a genius, who is universally respected in America. That's how he gets treated by these people. And he doesn't say anything. He just listens to them berate him. And when they're done, he gets up and leaves. And the story is that he just was shocked by the disrespectful attitude, and he understood immediately, like, if this is the way they're going to talk to me, and I'm the most important person in the colonies, and they're not even going to give me a chance to explain anything, not even a chance to open my mouth and speak, then I don't need to be here. This is pointless. And so he went back to America after getting chastised like he was a bad like a student that by a teacher, or by a principal, and he had behaved bad in the classroom. Went back and had changed his mind. It was one of the biggest mistakes. That it was a very arrogant thing for the British Parliament to do, because he would have been able to persuade a lot of people through his influence, because he was such an important person and because he was so well connected. Instead, Benjamin Franklin went back to the United States and said, yeah, they're not going to treat us, in any way, with any sort of respect or equality. We're not going to get anything out of this. They were deaf. They didn't even want to listen to what I had to say. So there's no point in trying to sort out, to make some kind of compromise or negotiate. They think they have absolute power over us, and so the independence is the answer. So Benjamin Franklin, switches sides, and instead of being a loyalist, did I write that here somewhere? I don't think I did. He instead of being a British loyalist, thinking that they should remain British, he becomes in favor of American independence. After they declare in 1776, once they gather together, they have a Continental Congress, and on July 4th, 1776, which is not really the beginning of the United States, it's the beginning of the war for the United States. But that's the day that Americans celebrate, is the beginning of the process of becoming the United States. So that's like, it's not Independence Day, because, they didn't actually instantly become independent. It wasn't like August 15th, 1945, where the Japanese surrendered and instantly South Korea and North Korea became independent, right? That on that day, the Japanese surrendered, and their control over Korea evaporated instantly. That's not what happened. 1776, they declared independence, but it was not accepted by anyone, anywhere, right? Of course, it wasn't accepted by the British, but it wasn't accepted by the Russians or the Spanish or the French either. Nobody recognized that statement except the Continental Congress themselves. Even the people even the British in the colonies, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire, and South Carolina, most of them didn't consider themselves independent that day. It would be 7 years later that the independence would actually complete. So remember that, because that might be a tricky question, on a quiz. Is like, when did America actually become independent, recognized as an independent country? The answer is 1783. So 1776 is when they get together and they draft this document called the Declaration of Independence, which is written by Thomas Jefferson, and they declare themselves independent. And this is how the declaration goes. You probably know these lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the most famous line in American history. That was written by Thomas Jefferson, but that's not how it starts. It starts like this. Let me start again. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. There's a lot of Benjamin Franklin in that, I think. Thomas Jefferson wrote it, but it was modified actually quite a bit. And Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer, and he was when he saw how much they had changed what he had originally wrote, he was actually mortified. He was crushed by that. He was not happy with all of these changes. So there's a lot of influence from other people. We always give credit to Thomas Jefferson, and we should, because he drafted it, but there was a lot of corrections to it. I think you can see in that opening section the influence of Benjamin Franklin there, who does think that they need to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, right? And they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Anyway, it was an effort by a young Thomas Jefferson and some collaboration in editing on the part of the other members of the Congress. Benjamin Franklin, once they do this, they know that they're not going to be able to do this without any help. So Benjamin Franklin actually is a bit of a Francophile, which means a lover of French culture and France in general. And he then became even more essential in his role as the ambassador of the new potential United States by going to France and speaking French fluently and spending his time convincing a French empire that had recently lost to the British Empire and was almost out of money, that it was a good idea for them to help these rebels in North America fight against the British. And it really wasn't. Objectively speaking, it was not a good idea for France to become involved in this. The French government was doing this in some sense to just disrupt the British, but they did think that if they could get these colonies to separate from the British, that they might together, have some more leverage, and they could take advantage. They would have, an alliance with the Americans, and together that they would be able to diminish the influence of the British and hem them in and reduce their expansion. So it made political sense, but it was financial suicide. But they did it, and part of the reason they did it, I have to, in my humble opinion, it must have partially been the fact that Benjamin Franklin dressed up as a frontiersman, wearing buckskins and like raccoon skins hat, and like walked around in Paris as this kind of like colonial French-speaking colonial performer. When some British guy who's now calling himself American and speaks excellent French and is very intelligent and charming and old, walking around in the streets of Paris. I think the upper class, the French aristocracy and the government officials, he was just a fascinating person. He was always a persuasive person to anyone, but he had a special skill in this situation to get these French, high, important, influential French people to support the war effort, and he was successful. First, George Washington had to do some damage to the British military. The French had to see them win something, and initially there was nothing. The British were defeating them over and over again, and it looked like they were going to lose the war right away. But one of George Washington's greatest qualities was his resilience, his bravery, and his charisma. So he would never. He was very logical and let's say strategically talented, but his war record is not like Yi Sun-shin. It's not like he fought against the British and never lost. He lost. He lost many times. He lost many battles, multiple battles, and it was a struggle. But he always overcame every situation. His soldiers believed absolutely that in his ability to get them out of any situation. And he had bullets go through his hat. He had bullets like go right, whizzing right by his body, by his horse. He was almost killed dozens of times, and he was never afraid of that. He was, as Yi Sun-shin and Napoleon and other leaders that are very brave. The soldiers are inspired from that, and they believe when their commander, makes a decision that he's going to bring victory. He's going to bring eventually, even if they lose a battle, that the next battle they'll win, because he proves it to them that the British are never gonna win. By the end, they can't beat Washington, because even if they beat him, he just comes back and he's got more men and more supplies, and the British military is supposed to be. Originally, the reason here is they're trying to get some tax money. They're trying to stabilize their finances, right? But they're unable to do that because they're fighting another war. So, it backfired completely. Now they're losing money. So, to stop the bleeding, they're basically going to allow the independence. They can't keep sending huge armor. They can't keep sending large amounts of soldiers to fight in America when they're not winning. And the colonists are fighting on home turf. They're fighting for their freedom and then for their protection of their territory. And the British soldiers aren't fighting they're just fighting to maintain control. They're just fighting on their own discipline. They're just fighting because their commanders tell them to fight. And that's a big disadvantage. So the Americans, as they learn how to fight, and George Washington gets more experience, and they believe in his leadership, the American army, the Continental Army, becomes stronger and stronger, and the British can't sustain their attack. So they win the war. And it's mostly because of, if you did not have, we have to talk about these things in a sort of what if counterfactual kind of perspective. You don't have George Washington, the army loses and gives up. You don't have Benjamin Franklin, you don't have the French money and support and weapons, and the British are able to, overwhelm them with their superior military power and numbers and experience, right? So you got to have both of these people. You have the political leadership and diplomacy of Benjamin Franklin giving you the support of the French, and you need George Washington's leadership on the battlefield. And George Washington's reputation just grows and grows until he's the logical choice to become the first president of the United States. Now, as you can see, if you know anything about American culture now, there was never like a real good consensus of how to make this country. Always New York and Virginia and South Carolina and Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire and Maryland. All of these colonies always disagreed about everything. Okay, somehow these skilled individuals, I'm only naming 3 of them, but these really talented leaders managed to convince other leaders by networking and by compromising and by alterations and by promises to knit the things together. And the reputation of George Washington and him being the first president twice, with the 100% of the votes twice, made the start of this new republic possible. And then the fact that he decided to, just retire after 2 terms, and he rejected the possibility of becoming a king, just transformed him into this figure of, a god, a hero of democracy, right? That's what the greatest American heroes should do. They should win victory on the battlefield, serve as a politician, and then retire, right? To Mount Vernon, to his plantation, and live a peaceful life without interfering with the next generation who's going to take over, and they're going to do the same kind of thing, and that's going to inspire another generation of great military and political heroes, and then they're going to give up their power, and they're going to start this continuous chain of peaceful transfers of power that are going to exist, which was almost disrupted by what Donald Trump attempted to do just a year and a half ago. But still, they managed to continue that tradition. Joe Biden is number 46. There's no other example of that in the history of mankind, that you've had peaceful transfers, unbroken peaceful transfers of power. The Civil War, you could argue, is a disruption, but the presidency was not broken. It went from Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. They won the war. He was assassinated, and then Andrew Johnson, his vice president, took over. There was no disruption of presidencies, despite the fact that America was fighting itself. America was fighting itself for 4.5 years, but they still maintained a continuous presidency, democratically elected presidency. It's remarkable. It all starts with George Washington. But let's talk about the faults of these people also. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they owned slaves. And many of the founding fathers of the large group of astounding intellectuals, they wrote this document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But there's a but. There's a great elephant in the room kind of but. This great contradiction, which means all men, and what about women, and what about other types of men? They intentionally wrote it like that, because a lot of the things about the Declaration of Independence are just principles. They're not exact. It's non-specific. It's very general, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. I'm not giving you a reason why it's this way. It just is, okay? It's purposely written that way so that it can be interpreted. And that was helpful to certain people. in certain parts of the United States who wanted to make a distinction between man and woman, and between races of people, and between free people and slaves, and between natives and Europeans, and so on. Right? This is a way to leave the door open to things that, according to the principle of the document, should not exist. Like every single human being, and what about animals and rocks and trees and animals, right? Sorry, I said animals twice there. But what about things that are not human? What about non-human things? Do they have rights as well? Do the buffalo have rights? Right? Does a forest have a right to exist, or can we just burn it down and cut it down and do whatever we want with it? There's a lot of loopholes in this document, but at the same time, you have to recognize how progressive this was. We always have to look at culture in its time. Remember, in last lecture we talked about medieval, right? There's something very modern about this declaration. It's framed principles of freedom. It's captured some things from the Enlightenment. It doesn't go far enough. It doesn't protect what it's attempting to do. It's a failed effort, but it's better. It's an effort, right? Again, you might look at this as America's Magna Carta, right? Magna Carta, what did it do? Not that much. It just made sure that the king couldn't run around sexually assaulting all of the barons' wives and relatives, female relatives, and couldn't tax them without, without their, some sort of negotiation and announcement, and that his absolute power was checked, and that people were allowed to have trials, and you couldn't execute people without, proper justice. These are some basic things which were ignored for a long time, but it was the start of a process that eventually turned into parliament. It turned into a constitutional monarchy eventually. Magna Carta was a especially progressive document for its time. None of the other kings of Europe signed that kind of thing in 1215, and no other countries, no other nations in this period. There's ancient Greece had its own form of democracy and that kind of thing, but no nation in this period is coming up with something like this. This is taking ideas from England, from France, right? From the Enlightenment, from the intellectuals, from humanism, and they're applying them to the formation of a new state. However, some things clearly are going to be a problem. The seeds of disharmony are there right from the beginning, and the Civil War is inevitable. There's this incongruity, there's contradiction between the reality of what the United States is and what the United States wants to be, and what it says it's going to be. And that's the slavery thing. Thomas Jefferson owns slaves. He's wealthy because he has a plantation. He's a lawyer, but he's married, and his wife dies. When his wife dies, he doesn't remarry because he promises his wife he never will remarry, but he has a relationship with a slave, right? And then he has children with this slave. And this slave that he's married to is, she looks almost like light-skinned because she only has 1/8 of her is African. So she looks like a white girl, essentially. She's very, very light-skinned. And he marries her and has children with her, even though she's much younger than her. She's much younger than him, and they have this relationship. And the most mind-boggling thing is that because she's a slave, he can treat her nicely or not, but she's a slave, and he owns her, and her children, which is his children too, are slaves. When they're born, from birth, they're slaves. It's one of, if you think slavery in general is a contradiction, what about the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, has a relationship with a slave, which he owns, and he has children that are born into slavery. He must be aware of how this is impossible to resolve. How can you live like that? I don't know how he did it. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson became the president of the United States. Most people don't know that story. Most people, especially people from other countries, including Canadians, don't know that most of the founding fathers had slaves. George Washington had a lot of slaves. He was very wealthy. He was, like the Bill Gates of his day. He didn't get paid for being a general. He got money from his plantation, and his plantation was worked by slaves. This is how George Washington supported himself. When he died, in his will, he freed all of the slaves that belonged to him, right? And that's his claim to generosity. But he still lived his whole life. He didn't free the slaves until he didn't need the wealth that they were producing. He only did it after he was gone. I'm still not going to be much of a George Washington fan compared to some of my, American friends, because I just can't get over that fact that he would, that doesn't redeem you from the things that you can't just on your deathbed ask for forgiveness for all the bad things that you did. George Washington did some great things, but he's a human being, and one of the things that one of his greatest faults, I think, was being a plantation owner. So this whole system of transferring slaves, African slaves, across the Atlantic to the Americas, and then picking up resources, bringing them back to Europe, and then getting goods that will be attractive to trade in West Africa, finished goods, cloth and cotton products, weapons, that kind of thing, equipment, tools that the Africans might want to trade for, will be brought down to West Africa, and then they will trade. I mean, Africa is having its own wars, and when the Europeans bring superior weapons and they supply them to certain African tribes, those African tribes can defeat other African tribes and take prisoners, and then they can trade those prisoners for more weapons and advantages and commodities. And the Europeans can use them as slaves to produce more resources. This is called the triangle trade, right? This is the Atlantic. It's the Atlantic slave trade, and it's a triangular system, and you can see how it works. It's like a vicious cycle. It builds on itself. It just gets, the more people you bring over here, the more resources you can produce. The more resources you can produce, the more goods you can manufacture, or bring from Europe to supply to fuel more the capture and trading of human beings. So it's considered one of the worst crimes against human beings in history. There are many. The Holocaust, World War II, among other tragic events. There are many different events across the world. The treatment of the natives in North and South America, the conquering of Mexico and South America, the colonization and the scramble for Africa. These are all terrible things that we have to recognize. But this is really, we're talking about something like 11 or 12 million people being forcibly moved without any, stripped of everything, stripped of their culture, their language, their history, their rights, their health, their friendship, their family, everything, and people profiting from that, taking everything away from them, and people making ridiculous amounts of money. Let's just say that the reason that this accelerates is because there's a huge amount of money to be made. And just as the British are deciding that they should stop trading in slaves, participating in the slave trade, after the war against the United States, they're starting to a movement is building to stop participating in this trade, despite the fact that the profits are unbelievable. The American interest in it, when they become independent, accelerates. They start importing more slaves, and the number just explodes. The number of Africans being transported to the south part of America increases substantially. So we're going to have to carry this over to onto Friday. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, and I have lots of answers. I don't know all the answers, but we need to really fill in the details here about what happens. One of the reasons why the Africans are displaced and is that there is already a sort of trade network of slaves going from Africa in different directions. So there is already African slaves being traded in markets in the Ottoman Empire at the time. And the Portuguese and the Spanish have already raided to try and have made contact with various people on the West African coast. So when the native population collapses and they can't find enough Europeans to do the work, there is this source of labor, this illegal source, this terribly amoral, cruel source of finding people to do the work, to power the economy. There is a massive demand, and so the price, the profits to be earned, and the price of a person is driven up to the point where many ships make the journey in order to get that economic benefit. Okay, we'll stop there for now. We're getting close to the end of chapter 4, where the title of the last section is America in Shackles. I really should say, I should say that in a different way, more like Shackling America or Americans in Shackles, because it's not America itself in shackles, it's actually the people. It's Americans in shackles. Anyway, at the end read to the end of that chapter there, because that's what we're going to finish up on Friday, and then we're going to move into chapter 5. If I have time, we'll be moving into chapter 5 as well. Okay? So thank you for listening as usual. Good luck with the quiz, and I'll see you on Friday in person again.